On August 23rd, 2013, inside of a little home in a Russian suburb, 8-year-old Maria Chelysheva was hard at work at her kitchen table drawing a picture of a horse. Maria's parents had recently brought her to a farm where she was able to do some pony riding, and ever since then, she had become obsessed with horses and ponies. And so as Maria was hard at work on her drawing, her father, 42-year-old Mikhail, was right nearby at the kitchen stove dicing up onions, and as he did, his eyes were kind of watering from cutting the onions, and so he was making a show of turning around and looking at his daughter, pretending to cry, and Maria thought it was very funny. And then at some point, as Mikhail was doing this, he realized he was missing a key ingredient for the dinner he was preparing. So he kind of threw up his hands in exasperation, and then he yelled out into the house to his wife, hey, do we have any potatoes? And from somewhere in the back of the house, Maria's mother called back, yes, we do. They're down in the cellar, but they're pretty old. And so Mikhail finished chopping his onions, he threw them into a hot pan, and then he walked out of the kitchen, poking Maria playfully as he walked by, and she kind of laughed at him. And then Maria watched as her father walked through the living room, past Maria's grandmother and brother, and he walked over to this door that was right at the beginning of this hallway, and that door led down into the cellar. And so Maria, she stopped for a moment and just watched as her dad opened the cellar door, began walking down the steps, and he shut the door behind him. And then Maria just went back to coloring in her horse. But after a few minutes, Maria started to smell something really bad, and she looked up and she saw the onions that were on the burner were starting to burn, and smoke was going up into the ceiling, and then suddenly the smoke alarm went off, and as this commotion is happening, Maria's grandmother runs into the kitchen and begins fanning the smoke. She turns off the burner and moves the onions, and then Maria's mother comes running into the kitchen, and she's seeing what's happening, and she's looking around. She doesn't see her husband, and so very frustratedly, she yells out, Mikhail, you burned the onions, come in and deal with this. But Mikhail was not on the first floor. He was still down in the cellar. And so Maria's mother knew that, and she was kind of annoyed that he was taking so long down there. And so after muttering something under her breath, she stormed out of the kitchen, walked over to the cellar door, opened it up, went downstairs, shutting the door behind her. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Maria's grandmother was now going through the burned onions, looking for any that were salvageable, and Maria had gone back to her horse drawing. But after about 5 minutes, it dawned on Maria that her parents had still not come out of the cellar yet, and it just felt like too much time had passed. They should be up by now. And so Maria stopped working on her picture and just stared down the hall at the cellar door. And at the same time, Maria's grandmother had stopped with the onions, and she too had come over and was watching from right next to Maria down the hall at the cellar door. Both of them just expecting the parents to emerge any second. But as the seconds ticked by, nobody emerged from the cellar. And so finally, Maria's grandmother said, okay, I'm gonna go see what's going on. And so Maria watched as her grandmother walked through the living room, past Maria's brother, who was playing a video game. And then Maria's grandmother, right in front of the closed cellar door, just yelled out, hey, are you guys okay down there? But there was no response from the cellar. And so with this, Maria's grandmother turned around and told Maria's brother to turn off his video game because it was so noisy. Maybe they were calling from the cellar and they couldn't hear them. And so the brother, who was just totally frustrated by this whole situation, he paused his game, and then Maria's grandmother called out again, hey, are you guys okay down there? And this time, when there was still silence, Maria's brother, he just stood up and said, okay, why don't we just go downstairs and make sure they're okay? Why aren't we doing that? And so without waiting for a response from his grandmother, Maria's brother just walked right over to the cellar door. He opened it up and he looked down and he goes, look, they're right there. And then the brother began walking down the steps, yelling to his parents, hey, come on, when's dinner? What's going on? And as he did, he shut the door behind him. And so after this, Maria's grandmother walked back into the kitchen and sat with Maria as the two of them stared at the cellar door, expecting their family to return any second now. But they didn't. And so at this point, both Maria and her grandmother were really starting to panic. They could tell something was wrong. And so Maria's grandmother grabbed her phone and called a neighbor and just said, hey, can you come over? I think something's wrong. I don't know what it is. And then after Maria's grandmother hung up the phone, instead of waiting for the neighbor to come over, Maria's grandmother just got up and walked right over to the cellar door, then opened the door and began walking down the stairs. But this time, the grandmother left the door open. And so Maria was able to listen from her seat in the kitchen to the sound of her grandmother's footsteps making their way down the stairs. And then at some point, Maria heard what sounded like a distinct thud and then silence. Now, at this point, Maria is terrified. The neighbor has not come over yet. And so without knowing what else to do, she just got up and walked over to the open cellar door and just stared down into the darkness down below. She couldn't see anything, but she was too scared to even call out to her family. And then finally, she just began descending the stairs herself. 10 minutes later, the neighbor who Maria's grandmother had called finally arrived over at their house. He knocked on the front door, but there was no answer, and so he tried the doorknob, found it unlocked, so he opened it up and he stepped inside. And right away, he looked around and it was totally quiet. There was nobody on the first floor of the house. But the neighbor immediately heard crying, and he walked around the first floor listening for where it was coming from, and he realized when he got to the top of the open door leading down into the cellar that the crying was coming from down there. And so without a thought, the neighbor just ran down the stairs, and he couldn't believe what he found. He found Maria, the 8-year-old, just crying on the ground, and all around her was her entire family just laying on the ground. Now, the neighbor had no idea what was going on, but sensing clearly there was some sort of emergency based on the call he got and what he was seeing now, he just scooped up Maria, ran upstairs, and ran out of the house and began screaming for help. When help arrived, they would search the house and make their way down into the cellar, and they would discover that Maria's entire family, her grandmother, her brother, her parents, they were all dead. And what had killed them were the very potatoes that Mikhail had gone down to get. It would turn out Maria's mother was right when she warned Mikhail that the potatoes they had downstairs were very old. In fact, they were so old, they had begun to rot, and as they rotted, they produced this toxic fume that did not ventilate out of the cellar. The cellar was totally enclosed, there was no windows, and the family had this habit of always shutting the door whenever they went down into the cellar. And so over time, this fume had totally filled the entire cellar, and one by one, as family members went down into the cellar, sealing the door behind them, they passed out from these fumes and then died. Maria was the only one who survived going down into the cellar because her grandmother, who had gone down right before her, had left the door open. And so by the time Maria had gone down, a lot of the toxic fumes had found their way up the stairs and escaped into the rest of the house. And so when Maria went down there, it was not nearly as toxic.